The rain fell on the city like a sheet of hammered glass, blurring the skyline into a charcoal smudge. From his corner office on the 82nd floor, Julian Thorne watched the storm, but he did not see it. His world had been reduced to the cold blue light of a monitor and the disembodied voices of his board of directors, a chorus of cautious disapproval filtered through a speakerphone. They spoke of market volatility and shareholder confidence, words that had once formed the very architecture of his life, but now felt like a foreign language. He was the CEO of Thorne Consolidated, a titan of industry built by his father and grandfather. It was a legacy of steel and concrete, of numbers that only ever went up. Yet, Julian felt a hollowness that no quarterly report could fill. His life was a sterile masterpiece of expensive art he never looked at, and a penthouse apartment where the only sound was the hum of the climate control. He was isolated, a king in a silent, gilded cage. The pressure had been mounting for months. A hostile takeover attempt, whispers of internal dissent, and the constant, grinding expectation to be more ruthless than his father had ever been. Tonight, it had reached a crescendo. The board demanded a decision, a strategic sacrifice that felt more like a betrayal. He needed to escape, if only for a day. He ended the call abruptly, leaving their protests hanging in the air. He grabbed a simple duffel bag, a decoy for a man who never traveled without an entourage, and left the office without a word to his assistant. Hours later, he was just another face in the chaotic thrum of the international airport. The storm that had been a distant spectacle from his office was now a visceral reality, grounding flights and fraying nerves. The air was thick with the scent of wet coats and anxiety. Flickering fluorescent lights overhead cast long, dancing shadows, making ghosts of the weary travelers. It was here, in this anonymous purgatory, that Julian's carefully constructed world finally shattered. A sharp, searing pain shot through his chest, his vision narrowed to a pinpoint, and the floor rushed up to meet him. Elena Vance had been trying to keep her 6-year-old son, Leo, entertained for 3 hours. Their flight to visit her sister was canceled, and the rebooking line was a testament to human misery. She was a nurse, accustomed to long shifts and high-stress situations, but the exhaustion was bone-deep. She was a single mother, and this trip was meant to be their first real vacation since her husband, Mark, had died 2 years ago. Every dollar for it had been carefully saved, a small beacon of hope in a life defined by quiet struggle. Leo was starting to wilt, his head drooping against her shoulder. She was murmuring a story into his ear when a commotion erupted nearby. A man had collapsed. Without a second thought, her training took over. She scooped up a sleeping Leo, settled him onto a nearby bench with their bag as a pillow, and pushed through the small crowd that had gathered. "Let me through," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm a nurse." She knelt beside the man. He was sprawled on the cold linoleum, his face pale and slick with sweat. His suit was expensive, impeccably tailored even in his dishevelment, but his breath was shallow and ragged. Elena's hands were steady as she checked his pulse, tilting his head back to clear his airway. She spoke to him in a low, soothing voice, the one she used on frightened patients and her own son after a nightmare. He was disoriented, his eyes struggling to focus. Airport paramedics arrived moments later, but Elena had already stabilized him. She relayed his vitals concisely, her professionalism a stark contrast to the surrounding chaos. As they helped him onto a gurney, the man fumbled for his wallet. He pulled out a thick wad of cash, trying to press it into her hand. "Thank you," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "For your trouble." Elena gently pushed his hand away. The gesture was instinctual, born of a deeply ingrained principle that kindness was not a transaction. "There's no trouble," she said softly. "It's what I do." She looked at his face then, truly looked past the expensive suit and the aura of power. There was something familiar in the line of his jaw, in the dark, troubled eyes. It was a ghost from another lifetime. He saw it too. As the fog of his collapse began to recede, his mind snagged on her face. The gentle curve of her smile, the quiet strength in her eyes. It was a face he hadn't seen in 15 years, not since high school, not since he was a boy with dreams that had nothing to do with boardrooms and stock prices. "Elena," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "Elena Vance." She froze. the name a key turning a lock in the deepest part of her memory. Julian Thorne. Her first love, the boy she had shared whispered secrets with under a canopy of summer stars. The boy who had disappeared from her life without a word after graduation. He looked different, harder, the easy smile of his youth replaced by a mask of weary authority. But it was him. Julian, she said, the name feeling strange and heavy on her tongue. The paramedics started to wheel him away, and for a moment, she thought that was it. Another fleeting encounter in a life full of them. But then he called out, his voice stronger now, cutting through the airport noise. Wait. The paramedics paused, and Julian pushed himself into a sitting position on the gurney, ignoring their protests. Your flight, he said, his mind racing. With the storm, it must be canceled. Elena simply nodded, her hand resting protectively on Leo's sleeping form. Julian's world, which had been spinning out of control, suddenly found a new, unexpected axis. Mine too, he said. Don't go anywhere. Please. It was a plea, not a command, delivered with a vulnerability he hadn't shown anyone in over a decade. He was the great Julian Thorne, a man who moved markets with a single word, and he was asking her to wait for him in a crowded airport terminal. Elena watched them wheel him toward the airport's medical clinic, her heart a tangled knot of confusion and a strange, long-dormant ache. The past had just collapsed into the present, and she had no idea what to do. She sat back down beside her son, pulling her thin coat tighter around her shoulders as if to ward off more than just the airport's chill. She was a single mother with a mountain of debt and a broken heart that had only just begun to mend. He was a man in $1,000 suit who had fallen out of the sky and back into her life. She should have walked away, but she didn't. She waited. An hour later, Julian returned. He had refused any further medical treatment, signing the release forms against the clinic doctor's advice. He had changed out of the suit and into a simple pair of jeans and a sweater from his duffel bag, an attempt to shed the skin of his corporate life. He looked younger, but no less tired. He found Elena and Leo huddled together on the bench, Leo now awake and playing with a small, worn-out toy car. They said it was just exhaustion, Julian said, his voice a little stiff. Too much work. Not enough sleep. He gestured vaguely to the seat beside her. Is this spot taken? Elena shook her head, and he sat down, leaving a careful distance between them. An awkward silence stretched, filled only by the drone of airport announcements and the happy vrooming sounds Leo was making. I can't believe it's you, Julian said finally, breaking the silence. After all this time, he looked at her, at the faint lines of worry around her eyes that hadn't been there when they were teenagers, at the simple, unadorned grace she still possessed. You're a nurse. It was a statement, not a question. It fit her perfectly. And she trailed off, unsure of what he was. The last she'd heard, his family had been well off, but the man before her radiated a level of wealth and power that was beyond anything she could have imagined. You're doing well for yourself, it seems, she finished lamely. A dry, humorless laugh escaped him. That's one way to put it. He didn't elaborate. He didn't want to be the CEO of Thorne Consolidated right now. He just wanted to be Julian, the boy who used to know the girl sitting next to him. His eyes fell on Leo, who had stopped playing with his car and was now staring at him with open, unabashed curiosity. And this must be your son, Julian said, his voice softening. This is Leo, Elena said, pulling the boy a little closer. Leo, this is an old friend of Mommy's. His name is Julian. Leo gave a small, shy wave. One of the wheels on his toy car chose that exact moment to pop off and skitter across the floor. The boy's face crumpled, a prelude to tears. It's broken, he whispered, his bottom lip trembling. Before Elena could comfort him, Julian leaned forward. Can I see? He asked gently. Leo hesitated, then held out the car and the tiny black wheel. Julian took them, his large, capable hands looking comically oversized as they handled the small plastic toy. He examined the axle for a moment. Then, with a surprising delicacy, he managed to press the wheel back into place. It wobbled slightly, but it held. He rolled it back to Leo. Good as new, he said. Leo's face lit up. He beamed at Julian, a pure, uncomplicated expression of gratitude. Thank you, mister, he said, and immediately went back to playing, the crisis averted. The small act seemed to break some of the tension between them. It was a simple, human gesture, devoid of agenda or transaction. It was a language Julian had almost forgotten how to speak. They talked for hours as the storm raged outside, and the departure board filled with red cancellation notices. She told him about Mark, her late husband, a kind and hard-working man who had died in a scaffolding collapse on a non-union construction site. She spoke of the grief and the struggle, but there was no self-pity in her voice, only a quiet resilience that Julian found himself deeply admiring. He learned about her life as a nurse, the long hours, the emotional toll, and the profound satisfaction she found in caring for others. He, in turn, told her very little about his own life. He spoke of his work in vague terms, calling it corporate management. He was ashamed of his world, of its predatory nature and its emotional emptiness. It felt grotesque to describe his penthouse and his private jet to a woman who had saved for a year just to take her son on a small vacation. So he listened instead, soaking in the details of her life, a life that felt more real and meaningful than his own had in years. As the night deepened, Leo finally fell into a deep sleep, his head in Elena's lap. The airport had thinned out, leaving them in a pocket of quiet intimacy. It was then that Leo, in his sleep, mumbled something and shifted, causing a small, folded piece of paper to fall from his pocket. Julian picked it up. It was a child's drawing, rendered in bright, waxy crayon. It showed 3 stick figures, a woman, a small boy, and a man, all holding hands under a very angry-looking, scribbled gray cloud with lightning bolts shooting out of it. Underneath, in shaky letters, Leo had written, "The Storm Family." Julian stared at the drawing, a strange tightness in his chest. A storm family, forged in the chaos of a canceled flight and a medical emergency. It was the most ludicrous and the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. This small boy, whom he had known for only a few hours, had included him in his world without question or hesitation. He had been given a place. He carefully folded the drawing and tucked it into his wallet, behind the credit cards and the corporate IDs. It felt like the only valuable thing he owned. He looked at Elena, her face soft in the dim light as she watched her sleeping son. "He's a great kid," Julian said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "You've done an amazing job." "He's my whole world," she replied simply. She finally asked the question that had been hovering between them since he had first said her name. "What happened to you, Julian? After high school, you just disappeared." The question landed with a heavy thud. He looked away, at his own reflection in the dark glass of the airport windows. He saw a stranger looking back at him. "My father died," he said, the words flat and sterile. "It was sudden. I had to take over the family business. There wasn't time for anything else. It was the truth, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that he had let the business consume him, had used it as an excuse to wall himself off from the messy, unpredictable world of human connection. He had chosen the cage. Eventually, the airline found them seats on the first flight out in the morning. They didn't exchange numbers. It felt too deliberate, too much like a promise. Their encounter felt like a strange, hermetically sealed event, a bubble in time that would pop as soon as the sun came up. As they boarded their separate flights, hers to a family vacation, his back to a corporate war, there was a sense of finality. But as Julian sat in his first-class seat, he knew he couldn't let it end. He pulled the crayon drawing from his wallet. A storm family. He had to find her again. Returning to his life was like stepping back into a cold, airless room. The crisis with the board was waiting for him, more venomous than before. The man leading the hostile takeover attempt was a rival he had known for years, but the real threat, he was beginning to suspect, was closer. His second-in-command, Marcus Vance, no relation to Elena, a cruel irony, was just a little too eager, his advice a little too slick. Julian started digging. He hired a private investigator, not to find Elena. He wanted to do that himself, but to look into Marcus's affairs. Meanwhile, he couldn't get Elena out of his mind. He remembered the name of the hospital she had mentioned she worked at. He sent an anonymous donation to their pediatric wing, a sum large enough to refurbish the entire floor. Then, a week later, he went there himself. He found her in the cafeteria on her lunch break, looking tired but beautiful under the harsh fluorescent lights. She was surprised to see him. He felt awkward and out of place, a wolf in a sheep's den. He made a clumsy excuse about being in the neighborhood. They made small talk, but the easy intimacy of the airport was gone, replaced by the stark reality of their different worlds. He could see the questions in her eyes. Who was this man, really? He started visiting regularly. He would bring coffee for the nurse's station or books for the children's ward. He never stayed long, just long enough for a brief conversation with Elena. He learned the names of her colleagues, the rhythm of her shifts. He met Leo again, this time in the daylight. The boy remembered him as the man who fixed his car and greeted him with a hug that nearly buckled Julian's knees. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to build a bridge into her world. He learned to be Julian again, not Mr. Thorne. He helped Elena carry her groceries up the 3 flights of stairs to her small, clean apartment. He sat at her worn kitchen table and drank tea while Leo showed him his latest drawings. In her home, surrounded by the scent of laundry detergent and the sound of a child's laughter, the hollowness inside him began to recede. He saw how she managed her tight budget, how she turned down a new pair of shoes for herself so Leo could have a new coat. He saw her unwavering integrity in 100 small ways every day. One evening, while helping her fix a leaky faucet, he confessed. Not everything, but a part of it. He told her he ran a company, that it was his father's, and that it was a heavy burden. He told her he felt lost in it. She listened without judgment, simply handing him a wrench and saying, "Everyone feels lost sometimes. The important thing is to find your way back." Her simple faith in him was a lifeline. The report from the private investigator landed on his desk like a bomb. It was worse than he had imagined. Marcus wasn't just planning a takeover. He was actively sabotaging the company from within. He had been falsifying safety inspection reports and cutting corners on material quality for a major downtown skyscraper project, channeling the saved money into an offshore account. He was devaluing the company's assets and reputation to make it ripe for a buyout, while simultaneously putting hundreds of workers' lives at risk. The report contained a list of subcontractors. As Julian's eyes scanned the page, his blood ran cold. He saw the name of the company that had been managing the site where Elena's husband, Mark, had died. It was one of theirs. A subsidiary Thorne Consolidated had acquired 3 years ago. The negligence that had made Elena a widow and Leo fatherless had happened on his watch. He felt a wave of nausea. His company, his legacy, was built on the same kind of rot that had taken her husband's life. The crisis was no longer just about business. It was deeply, horrifically personal. He convened an emergency meeting with the board. He laid out the evidence against Marcus. Their reaction was not outrage, but cold, pragmatic fear. They saw the looming scandal, the collapse of their stock price, the public relations nightmare. Their advice was unanimous: bury it. Fire Marcus quietly, pay him off, and fix the safety issues behind the scenes. To go public would be corporate suicide. It would ruin the company and Julian along with it. He was at a crossroads. One path led to self-preservation, to protecting his wealth and the legacy his father had built. It was the path of silence, of compromise. It was the path he had been on his entire life. The other path was Elena's path. The path of integrity, of doing the right thing no matter the cost. It was the path of truth. That night, he drove to Elena's apartment. The rain was falling again, just as it had been the night they met. He looked like a ghost, his face pale and drawn. He didn't say anything, just stood in her doorway, dripping water onto her worn welcome mat. She took one look at him and understood. She didn't ask questions. She simply opened the door wider and said, "Come in." She made him a cup of tea, her hands moving with a quiet, calming efficiency. He sat at her kitchen table, the same table where he had felt more at home than in his own penthouse, and felt the carefully constructed walls of his life crumbling around him. He couldn't bring himself to tell her that his company was responsible for her husband's death. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on him, stealing his breath. He just looked at her, his eyes full of a despair she couldn't possibly understand, but could clearly see. She sat down opposite him, her gaze steady and compassionate. "Whatever it is," she said softly, her voice a balm on his raw nerves, "you'll do the right thing. I know you will." Her words were not a command or an expectation. They were a simple statement of fact. She saw a goodness in him that he had long ago stopped seeing in himself. Her unwavering belief in his moral character was the single anchor in his swirling vortex of fear and indecision. It was the final push he needed. He knew what he had to do. He had to blow the whistle on his own company. He had to choose her world over his. The next morning, Julian Thorne called a press conference. He didn't consult his board or his legal team. He walked into a room packed with journalists and television cameras, stood at the podium, and began to speak. He laid out Marcus Vance's fraud in meticulous, damning detail. He presented the falsified safety reports, the evidence of embezzlement, and the criminal negligence. But he didn't stop there. He didn't cast himself as the hero who had uncovered the villain. Instead, he turned the spotlight on himself. He admitted his own failure of oversight, his own complicity in a corporate culture that prioritized profit over people. And then, his voice cracking with an emotion the public had never seen from him, he confessed that a subsidiary of Thorne Consolidated was responsible for the construction accident that had killed Mark Vance 2 years prior. He said Elena's name. He said Leo's name. He owned the sin completely. He announced he was stepping down as CEO, effective immediately. He was turning over all his evidence to the district attorney's office and establishing a multi-million-dollar compensation fund for the families of all victims of his company's negligence, using his own personal fortune to seed it. He would cooperate fully with all investigations, and he would accept whatever consequences the law demanded. He ended his speech, looked directly into the cameras, and said, "I am truly, deeply sorry." Then he walked away from the podium, leaving behind a stunned silence and the ruins of his empire. Elena was in the hospital break room, catching a rare moment of quiet during a chaotic shift. The press conference was playing on the small television mounted in the corner. She watched, her cup of coffee forgotten in her hand, as the man she had been tentatively letting into her life systematically dismantled it on national television. She heard him say her name and Mark's. The shock was a physical blow, but it was followed by a wave of something else, a profound, aching understanding. She wasn't seeing a CEO. She was seeing a man desperately trying to find his way back. The fallout was immediate and immense. Thorne Consolidated's stock plummeted. The board was in chaos. Marcus Vance was arrested. The media frenzy was relentless. But the public reaction was not what Julian's advisors had predicted. Mixed in with the corporate analysis and the talk of scandal was a current of admiration for his raw, shocking honesty. He wasn't just another corrupt CEO. He was a man who had sacrificed everything for the truth. He was, in a strange way, vindicated. He had lost his company, but he had saved his soul. A few days later, he came to her apartment. He was no longer the powerful executive. He was just Julian, a man stripped of his titles and his fortune. He stood before her, his shoulders slumped, prepared for her anger, for her hatred. He deserved it. "Elena," he started, his voice barely a whisper. "I am so sorry." She looked at him, and he saw no anger in her eyes, only a deep, sorrowful compassion. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, holding him as he began to tremble. There were no words to be said. They stood in the middle of her small living room, two survivors of a storm, and held on as the wreckage of his old life settled around them. In the quiet aftermath, their bond, tested by the most brutal of truths, solidified. They had faced the worst together, and they were still standing. A year passed. It was a year of legal battles, public scrutiny, and painful rebuilding. Julian avoided prison time due to his full cooperation, but the financial penalties were severe. He lost almost everything. The penthouse, the jet, the art collection. It was all liquidated to pay fines and contribute to the victims' fund he had established. He kept only enough to buy a small, unassuming house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. He had found a new purpose. The foundation he had created became his life's work. It advocated for stricter workplace safety regulations and provided financial and emotional support to families devastated by corporate negligence. His office was no longer on the 82nd floor. It was a small, rented space above a coffee shop, filled with secondhand furniture and a sense of mission. Elena was by his side through it all. She had left her demanding hospital job and now worked for the foundation as a family advocate, using her nursing skills and her own experience to guide people through their grief. They were a team, building something new and meaningful from the ashes of their pasts. His sterile, empty mansion was a distant memory. His new house was a home, filled with the scent of Elena's cooking, the sound of Leo's laughter, and the comfortable clutter of a life being truly lived. The crayon drawing of the Storm family, was framed and hung in the hallway. The transformation was complete. The expensive suits were replaced by soft flannel shirts, the cufflinks by a smear of paint from helping Leo with a school project. He learned how to cook, how to fix a bicycle chain, how to read a bedtime story with all the right voices. He was happier than he had ever been as a millionaire. He had discovered that true worth was not measured in stock prices, but in quiet moments of connection. Their new beginning was celebrated not with a lavish party, but with a small, heartfelt ceremony. It was the official opening of the Foundation's first major project, a free community health clinic for underserved families. It was a modest building, but it was built with integrity, a testament to their shared values. Friends, community leaders, and some of the families they had helped gathered on the small lawn under a clear, sunny sky. Julian gave a short speech, his words simple and direct. He spoke of second chances and the importance of community. Elena stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his back. As he finished, Leo, now 7 years old and radiating a quiet confidence, came to stand between them. He looked up at Julian, his eyes shining with pride. Later, as the small crowd mingled, Leo tugged on Julian's sleeve, his expression serious. "Can I show my dad our new clinic?" he asked, his voice carrying in the quiet afternoon air. The word hung there, simple and profound. My dad. It wasn't a question or a request. It was a statement of fact, of belonging. Julian's breath caught in his throat. He looked at Elena, his eyes swimming with tears. She met his gaze, and her smile was all the confirmation he needed in the world. This was his family. This was home. That evening, as the sun began to set, the three of them were in the small backyard of their house. They had bought a young maple sapling to plant, a symbol of their new roots. Julian dug the hole, his hands, once soft from a life of paperwork, now calloused and strong. Elena gently lowered the sapling into the earth, and Leo patted the soil around its base. As they worked, Julian paused and looked at a faint, silvery scar on the back of his hand, a long-forgotten injury from his reckless youth. It felt like a relic from another man's life, a life of isolation and ambition. Elena noticed his gaze. She reached out and placed her hand over his, her warmth covering the old mark. Their fingers intertwined around the trunk of the small tree. They were planting a future, together. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the sapling, a quiet promise of growth and strength to come. They had found their way through the storm and into the light.